So I'd like to welcome Tanya Bhanaut, who is a black belt, who has a black belt in karate, and Simon Dodd, who is an inclusive karate coach. Simon also has a background, an educational background with a Bachelor of Science in Sports Coaching and Development, a Master's in Sports Coaching. And Simon's club has also been awarded an In Sport Disability Inclusion Silver Award. And so the purpose of today's conversation is really for Tanya and Simon are going to share a lot about their personal experiences and their expertise and of all that they've been working together over the last few years. And so they're going to share a lot of what they've learned and their journey, and some tips and strategies that have worked well for them that could be relevant to you, to other coaches, and that may even get you thinking about your own creativity and processes for inclusive practice. And so Tanya, could you share a little bit about yourself? You have a black belt in karate. You also have dyspraxia. And so would you like to share with us a little bit about what that looks like for you?
Okay, so so I actually originally started karate because of the dyspraxia. So when I was going to a lot of educational professionals and that, and I was told that because of the dyspraxia I should either study martial arts or dance to kind of help improve the gross motor skills, which were pretty bad at the time. And I mean, I'd watched Karate Kid when I was younger, so kind of my parents were like, oh, try both and see what you like, and I'd kind of already made my decision, to be honest. So I went along, and at the time Simon wasn't the instructor. He was a black belt in the club. I think you were about 16 when I joined.
Yes, more than likely.
And I think I was somewhere between 9 and 11. I'm not sure which one, but yeah, I started and I was horrifically bad at it. And for many years I continued to be really, really bad. And I don't think it started clicking until I got to about purple belt. But the biggest improvement did come kind of about, I would say, a year after Simon had switched to teaching. So there was kind of a phase where Simon was getting used to teaching, and then like he started to do all this really awesome stuff that I hadn't been taught before, and it was working really well. And that's when I kind of felt like the dyspraxia stopped being so much of a problem.
I mean, I should just quickly say as well that I probably would have been 15 or 16 when Tanya started. So we were at opposite ends of the class essentially. But even at that stage, one of my responsibilities in the club was normally to teach beginners. So while I actually genuinely don't have many memories of, I can't really remember teaching Tanya when she was at the beginning, at some stage I would have been working with her probably on her first few lessons as well. But having also had no knowledge of that she was dyspraxic, or even had any knowledge of what dyspraxia was, I would have just treated her like any other beginner coming into the club, and would have been directed by my instructor to go and work with her or any other beginners for 15-20 minutes of a lesson before rejoining the class then as well.
Okay, yeah. So you were, in that sense, it was naturally inclusive. And Tanya, you say that there at a certain point there was a shift. So obviously something changed, and we can go into a little bit more about the coaching and some of the tips, what specifically it was. But could you say even at this point what it was really that, what it was that helped you really click, and what was it about the dyspraxia that was making it hard for you to click with it up until that point?
So what was hard about the dyspraxia, because I'll talk about that first, I think, if that makes most sense, was, I mean, it's essentially a learning disability But unlike with many learning disabilities where, I mean, it doesn't affect your intellect at all. It doesn't affect, really academic subjects that much. To a degree that can affect mathematics because there can be an element of dyscalculia, but the main thing that it affects is your motor skills. So like how dyslexic people struggle with, learning to read and learning things like that. People with dyspraxia, their learning difficulty impacts their ability to learn gross and fine motor skills. And which one is more prominent varies from person to person. With me, originally it was both, and I would say now, probably because of the karate, it impacts my fine motor skills much more dramatically. So I still have difficulty with things like, say, tying shoelaces. I have to think through every single step. But at the time when I was younger, I couldn't learn how to catch a ball. I did not learn to ride a bicycle until I was 19 years old, and that was because a chaplain at my university was a keen cyclist and taught me. Okay. So he actually had to teach me how to ride a bicycle, and now I can do that. But all of these things, whereas I think most people seem to have a kind of natural instinct of how to move, it is just not there. So I have to learn everything from a kind of point of absolute zero. Dyspraxia also comes with certain things like muscle weakness. So I don't know if you want this demonstration, but there is a certain double jointedness. So my arm actually reverses. And I couldn't do things. So I remember, I've got quite a vivid memory of in PE in school, and they were doing, climbing up ropes. And normally small kids, because they're quite lightweight, can climb up a rope quite easily. And I remember being the only one who couldn't do it. And, not being able to do a forward roll. And so these things, like, they still stick in my mind, and I still remember not being able to do them. But there are also other things that kind of come with it. So some of the slightly stranger things are so I can have issues with visual and auditory things. So sometimes the sensory input can be very overwhelming. Sometimes I get this kind of visual collapse where just people will seem to zoom in as if my depth perception has kind of just switched off. So you could be standing there, and or I remember at times seeing Simon doing demonstrations, and all of a sudden I would be like, oh, it's like he's suddenly like right here, but he's just a smaller size, rather than actually being further away, and that was really disorienting. And also one big thing which has been really huge for me is major issues with fatigue. So I just have not been able to kind of train, and I still seem to not be able to train the way that I would like, because what other people seem to be able to do quite easily, I can't do and remain a kind of functional person. And it seems for me, whereas some people can be very physically tired and their minds will still be fine, for me, if I'm physically tired from training, it kind of comes from the same, it affects me in the same way as if I just haven't slept. And my mind will start to, not function, and I won't be able to think as well. So those are kind of all the issues that I have with dyspraxia.
Okay, and more considerations, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that you two have overcome all of those, and how you've managed to make it work for you two, and because obviously you've done something right. You have a black belt now in karate, and could you say, or either of you share a little bit more about why karate is such an ideal activity or physical activity for someone with dyspraxia?
I mean, from my point of view, one of the things that I find very common with a lot of martial arts is that you tend to get a lot of people join it who have struggled in other sport activities. I mean, I don't tend to think of the martial arts as a sport. I think of them as a martial art first, and with a sport element attached to them, if you choose to go down that route. But people who have traditionally failed to engage with, if I say classic sports, your football, your rugby, your gymnastics and athletics, it's very often that if they struggle in those environments, they'll actually click in a karate environment. And part of that, I think, is because there's a very different focus in a karate environment. And certainly if I use the term traditional martial arts, I mean very much the traditional Japanese martial arts that people would associate with a belt system and that sort of approach. The environment itself is almost built in a way that helps. And I've often described karate as being an individual activity with a team atmosphere. And I think this is where a lot of people struggle in other sports, is that if they are purely a team-based sport, which is often what you will do going through school, if you're not particularly good at it when you start, you become the weak link in a team, and you become the person that gets picked last, and you start to just lose interest and feel like you're holding people back. Whereas in karate, you are purely working on your own development, and you're not reliant on other people to be a good performer yourself, and nor will you necessarily hold other people back. Part of this is because, I mean, with a belt system, a very rigid hierarchy, essentially, you've got the structure naturally puts people of a similar ability working together, rather than basing it on on age or any of those things. So it helps to almost compartmentalize people in a positive way, where they can mostly just focus on themselves. And it takes away that pressure of not necessarily not being good at something from the word go no longer matters, because everyone understands that you've just started. And the martial artists tend to always remember those early days as well. We always describe it to beginners as like learning to walk all over again, because it is an alien practice to anything else that they've probably done before. And when it comes to then with anyone with a disability, or like Tanya with dyspraxia, I mean, just speaking from a coaching point of view, I feel like that takes some of the pressure off. And there's very much a big focus on precision in it as well. There's a culture fostered that tries to strive for technical excellence, and actually certainly with Tanya, from my experience, that's been a good thing. It's allowed her to really focus hard on getting things right, no matter how long it takes. And that's something we say to everybody. It doesn't matter how long it takes to improve. A small improvement is still an improvement. And
I think that's one really important thing, actually, because with the belt system, because you come into a martial arts club, and if you've never done it before, people, it's not just that you're we understand you're a beginner. You are expected to be bad at it, and the assumption is that, and you're pretty much told, look, you've just started, you will be bad at this. Do not try and compare yourself. I remember being explicitly told, yeah, I know the black belts can do that stuff, but they've been doing it for ages. That's the only reason why they can do that stuff. Don't even consider comparing yourself to them. It's just, there's no point. Whereas in, that school environment, the people who are naturally talented got all the attention, and if you couldn't do something, it was like, oh, well, I guess you must not be talented at it. Whereas in martial arts, no, of course you can't do it. You've only just started. It would be ridiculous to think that you could do it,
I actually I can relate to that from what Tanya said, because I was actually a very sporty person going through my school years, but not in school. So I was at some point during my school life, I got my first dan. I was competing at a high level as well in karate, but I was also a pretty good badminton player, and I did a lot of other sports to a good level. But I was also incredibly shy when I was in school. So I was one of those students that I wasn't the worst in the group. I wasn't the best in the group. I was somewhere lost in the middle because I did enough that I didn't require any attention. But I wasn't good enough to get the attention to get into teams either. And I kind of just hovered my way through that PE environment all the way through school without probably ever getting noticed. And I think that sort of focus on the best and the worst is typically what happens in those environments. Whereas in karate, with I mentioned the belt system, I would say I wouldn't necessarily say, like Tanya said, you're going to be bad at this, but I would normally say exactly, she said, don't compare yourself to black belts. Yes, you may want to aim for that in the long term, but I would normally encourage a white belt to say, look at the next belt up and try and be as good as them. Aim for that level. And essentially it becomes like a little step ladder working its way up there for you, that you can visibly see small steps along the way to that coveted black belt that everyone wants.
I mean, also kind of in a sense, like, yeah, you don't want to compare yourself to a black belt, because black belts and white belts are kind of taught to do different things. I mean, you know, you learn like the textbook way as a white belt, and you're learning those long stances because you're trying to build up your leg muscles and your flexibility. And then you get to black belt and it's like, okay, now you've done that, now it's time to do things a little bit more realistic. But I think
it's almost a naturally inbuilt long-term and short-term goals within a system, which certainly helps.
But I think when you compare that to the school environment, I remember once there being this school assembly, and they got like some of the kids who were into gymnastics to do a performance, and the assembly was like, the theme of the assembly was talent. And I remember the teacher saying, like, you know, you may wish you were good at that, but if you're not, don't worry, you'll be good at something else. And I still remember like how like terrible that was. And you know, it was just this kind of, what an awful message to be giving kids. Like, oh yeah, like, sure, those people, like, they were just able to, like, you know, do crazy stunts and backflip because they were talented at it, you know, like they never had to practice or anything. And I think that's a really, really bad thing that schools do. They pass on this message. And certainly the school that I mean, we actually went to the same school in different years, obviously, but you know, that school was very much this, they imparted this message of kind of, you're either naturally good at something or you're not, just focus on whatever it is you're naturally good at.
Not
but
quite
of course
embracing the quality physical education approach that embeds inclusion within that.
It's interesting. I mean, I'd never thought about that, in all honesty, Tanya, but now you say it, I can't think of a time en masse where it was often stated how much, you know, people who are talented, you know, some people naturally take to things, but it's never mentioned really how much hard work then goes in to the point they've got to. I will say that from a karate point of view, when I get beginners in, you know, sometimes I get the question, how long till I get my, till I get my black belt? And I always say to them, well, if you work incredibly hard and you train 3 times a week and or more, and practice at home and put everything you've got into it, maybe 5 years. And they can't believe it when I say that. They're thinking, well, surely it'd be a year or 2 years. But I'm always upfront about how much work is going to go in there, so people aren't under any illusions before they start that it's going to be an easy journey, but it's something worth working towards.
Yeah, it's kind of like getting a like a PhD in, for me at least, doing karate and getting that black belt, it was like getting a PhD in physical education. And it felt very much, you know, similar to the process of getting my MA and all of that, but I was more proud of it because I'd worked so much longer and so much harder on it.
Yeah, because it is all relative then as well, you know, depending on how much people put into it, and then obviously their needs and you know, because, and I know from previous conversations, we all agree that there is no one size fits all, especially when it comes to inclusion, you know, and seeing how you two have worked together and collaborated more than, you know, you've really collaborated from what I can tell on working together and really progressing together. Both of you have progressed. I suppose, Tanya, you've progressed as a through the belt system to get your black belt, and Simon, you've gone from being a coach who was just naturally inclusive without even realizing, and then finding yourself in a role where all of a sudden you were practicing inclusively without even having trained in inclusive martial arts, and you just found yourself there, and from what I can tell, you had this approach that was open, problem solving, and that's what worked for you, and you progressed in that way. But I'd love to hear, you know, a little bit about how, or if you have any tips or guidelines on how somebody would, once they have a student in their class and they realize the student has some sort of additional needs or some sort of needs that they need to be identified to really support that person. Do you have any tips or guidelines on how you would get to know the participant or the student better in that way?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I will just reference back to one of our previous conversations we'd had, where I remember early on when we spoke, you referred to me as an expert, and you saw immediately I didn't like being labeled as an expert in inclusion, and you came up with a wonderful phrase which I liked, which is you referred to me as naturally competent. And the message I would say to any coaches is that you don't have to be an expert in disabilities or inclusion. It's primarily about, you've got to get the engagement with a student first. That has to come first. And you know, the teaching and the training world talks a lot about student-centered approaches, and it is right. And even more so when it comes to inclusion for disability. My biggest advice I can give is, don't be afraid of being ignorant about disabilities. I learned everything I know about disabilities from people with those disabilities. And the first time I had to bring these things up to people, where, you know, someone had maybe come to me and said, you know, in Tanya's case, they said they're dyspraxic. I'm, you know, if Tanya had come to me and said I'm dyspraxic, I would have probably started off with saying, oh, I have no idea what that is. What is it? And yes, there would have been some trepidation from my point of view as a coach, thinking I should probably know this. But it was better to be ignorant for a moment than try to just sort of blag my way past it and then go away and read about it instead. It was much better to hear it straight from the other people. And so
I think that might have been what you did.
Most likely, I don't think I had a clue what dyspraxia was until you'd mentioned it.
No, because I think I remember kind of like describing it to you, and then you said something along the lines of, "Oh, I would never have guessed that," or something.
Yeah, it's very true. The thing from I would tell any coach, if they're concerned about this, is never be afraid of what they think are stupid questions. They have to be open to ask them. A lot of that comes down to developing a rapport with somebody. Now, if that's someone that you've known for a while, then that's fantastic. If it's a new student who comes to you, or say the parent of a younger student perhaps, and says that, you know, my child has been diagnosed with XYZ, in some instances it can be more comfortable to start by talking to the parent or the guardian about it first and get some of their thoughts. But I always try to say, even if it was a young child, try and get them involved in the conversation, because they will need to know how it will affect them from a karate point of view. And the first thing I always de-emphasize for people is, don't look at the race to the black belt. You know, if you start with a group of people, some people may go ahead a bit quicker but slow down later. Some may take a while to start with and then race up a little bit quicker later on. And it's trying to take away the pressure for people of that race to black belt, or I must be this good at this point, and be open to having conversations about how they can make adaptations. Give the confidence to those people to come to you before or after a lesson or mid-lesson, put their hand up and say, I can't do this, and don't make it feel like they're bringing a problem to your class. And that really helps. I suppose my last point I would give to coaches is if the student is comfortable for you to make others aware of a disability, even if it was just a small group, say other assistant coaches, that can be very helpful. But I tend to like to encourage open discussion in the class. So if somebody is comfortable for me to let others know that they have a disability, because obviously not all disabilities are visible, that is actually really helpful because other students then understand. So for example, I've said to students in the club, no, Tanya has dyspraxia, and we'll happily explain to them what it is, because if she's doing partner work with them, she may take longer to work something out than they do, but they need to understand and appreciate that, and it's good for them to know from a general life point of view, because they will encounter people with disabilities outside the dojo as well.
I think
that
you
can
do
help.
have to be careful with that though, because I mean I have come across some things with, say, there are people who are sort of like mid-grade, so kind of like green belt, purple belt, who, if they find out about that, suddenly they think they can tell me how to do techniques.
Yes, I mean that
And
comes down to knowing the
that can be
students.
that can be a bit of an issue. And you know, a lot of the times I've kind of had to be like, hang on, you're I mean, and these have been children, right? These have been, you know, what, 15-year-olds and things. It's like, I've been doing this for 10 years. I know how to do a maigeri, you know? And there have been those scenarios which have cropped up. In fairness, I think those scenarios would have occurred, you know, if they knew about the dyspraxia or not. But when those scenarios do crop up, they can kind of, there is the potential for those people to think, oh, because, and you know, these were people who didn't know what they were talking about. You know, I don't mind if someone tells me, oh, you know, you need to do this or something, but if it's kind of happening all the time and they're telling me things that either I know anyway and I'm currently working on, or they're just telling me things that are flat out incorrect because it comes from a place of wanting to show off, there is an issue there, because as a senior grade I have to be able to be seen to be capable of teaching other students. And so if I'm being undermined, there can be those issues, and those issues can come up.
Yes, I do agree with that. It's I mean, I think this is where a trust element between student and teacher is important. Once you build up a rapport and you have trust there, you know, I would only do that if, you know, if someone was comfortable for me to do so. You know, there are students in my class who do have disabilities that others in the club don't know about, which is exactly how it should be. That's their choice if they'd rather it not brought up. Those that are comfortable discussing it, I think, you know, I would encourage that discussion as long as it's in the right environment. But I certainly think coaches, if they can foster trust with an individual and develop that rapport, that's a discussion that they would have to have themselves.
And one thing I was really glad that came out of that actually was because not only the students but the parents of some of the younger students knew that I had dyspraxia. I actually had the parents of, so I remember there's one person, I think you know who I'm referring to. I had a parent come up to me and say, oh, you know, my son's got dyspraxia, like, and wanting to talk to me and saying like, how did you deal with it? How did you find it in school? Kind of what can I expect? And, you know, asking me all of these questions. And that was great, because then I was able to say, you know, like, these are the things you can do to kind of give him an easier ride of it, or these are the things that you can do to help him, and that have helped me. And I think that was really helpful for that parent, and I hope it was helpful for that boy as well.
I mean, if I may quickly, because Tanya doesn't know this, that the parent actually came to me one day very, very stressed, because the parent also trains with me, and they'd just had this diagnosis and were quite, they weren't, it wasn't that they were concerned, but of course it was something that was unexpected to them, and they were trying to work out what it meant for them. And they came and spoke to me at the beginning of a class, and it was at that point that, because of my relationship with Tanya, I knew she wouldn't object to me mentioning that she had the same condition. She was dyspraxic as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made a decision to mention this to the parent and say, if you get a chance, go and have a conversation with Tanya, because she will be able to tell you what it was like going through karate like that, and will be able to give far better information than I can. So I'm not saying it was because of me, but I'm just saying that I trusted the relationship between Tanya and I, that she wouldn't object to me doing that. And I think it was valuable to hear it from somebody who's had the experience firsthand instead.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's definitely been helpful.
Yeah, what I'm hearing in all of this, of what you're sharing, is that it's really having that, creating that relationship, that working relationship, or that welcome, warm, open environment. And an open environment doesn't mean everybody has to share everything, that
No.
there's but in certain situations it can serve, and it all really does boil down to having that relationship, a professional relationship with each person, that's really person centered. I think that's really what I'm hearing in what you're sharing. And Tanya, is there anything for you that really in particular that in your experience that really worked well for, because what I'm hearing in all of this as well is that it's not so much either about the diagnosis, it's not about dyspraxia, it's more about how does this affect the functional, how you function in martial arts, and that's really what it boils down to. And so when it came to you two, when you were first working together, is there anything that you could share more specifically about how was it that you two how did you find the way to figure out exactly what it was that you needed, and what would work for you?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, there was a point where I think there were two turning points. One was kind of around purple belt level, and that I'm not sure I can really explain it. I think it was just finally like things started to kind of click a bit. And I think that was just, the years of practice. But I think when I really, really started to understand karate, and kind of, it was actually things that were happening inside the dojo and outside the dojo. So inside the dojo, what was happening was that Simon, I think you'd been getting into, your research quite a lot, and you'd been looking into the history of karate and, Chinese martial arts, and really, Simon started to talk. Also, Simon's, I need to mention because she's really important, is that Simon's fiance, Kirsty, she has huge amounts of kind of knowledge in sort of like personal training type arena, and kind of understanding physiology and how the human body works. So one was like Simon's knowledge of the history of karate, and why techniques were developed. He started talking about that, but he also, because of, I think this is a lot due to Kirsty's influence, he started talking about biomechanics, and when you do a punch, you have to use your back muscle to power the punch, and he started going really, really in depth. And then what happened from that was that, kind of because of those influences, I also became a bit interested in things like conditioning, and okay, like how can I make myself a better martial artist in terms of like being physically fitter, and being stronger. And then I looked into things like strength training. And to do that, I realized, okay, if I want to do this without injuring myself, I have to learn how the human body works, because I have to, you know, if you do a deadlift wrong, you'll put your back out. So you have to, I was starting to watch videos, and I was starting to read about how certain joints did what things. And then another thing happened, which was that my mother is actually, not as her main job, but she is a qualified yoga instructor. And she started taking me to these so she's with this thing called the British Wheel of Yoga, and they have this sort of annual event. And I started going to those events with her. And I mean, people think of yoga as being quite brutal, but I mean, quite gentle, but I mean, I would go to these things, and it was brutal beyond. It was really, you know, I'd just be like, oh, I'm in so much pain, and but in not in an unhealthy way, but you know, you could really feel it. And I'd come home and I'd be like, I can touch my toes now, what's going on? And when I couldn't before. And so I started asking her about that, and she started teaching me all about that. So then she started, okay, well, she's like, first thing I'm going to teach you is just how to stand. And she literally just had me stand up, and then she was telling me all of these things about, oh, now you need to do this with the muscle in your feet. And she would go through my whole body, and I'd literally just be standing there, like, not doing anything, and she'd go for like, you know, like 5 minutes just on how I was doing that.
Tadasana.
And so, yeah,
not as easy as it looks.
no, and so that started coming into my karate, and I still, she would actually tell me, she said, you know, you've got, after a while, and I'd practice that, and she'd say to me, you know, you've now got one of the best postures in the club. I'm really proud of you, because it was because of her doing that. So all of this information on kind of how the human body worked, and like how I was supposed to kind of operate this machine, kind of came into being. Because when you have dyspraxia, it's like you've got this disconnect. So it's like you're up here, and all of this is not really you. It's just kind of this thing, and like you're like a little person operating the controls, but this doesn't feel like you. You feel very detached, and that's when that stopped.
Remember,
And
Tanya,
I started.
sorry, Tanya, I thought I had to share this. You once described it to me as, instead of your brain pressing a button to fire a muscle, it was more like it was writing a letter and sending it by second class post. That was how you described it to me once, and I never forgot it, because it was, you said it was like it was like you were having to send almost smoke signals backwards and forwards instead of just a button press, and off goes that muscle group.
Because other people could do that, but I had to figure out. So like, that was the turning point, because suddenly, whereas I said, you know, other people, from what I have observed, I don't know what it's like to experience this myself, but other people seem to have this kind of natural understanding of how to move, but I had nothing. So, but when people started telling me, oh, by the way, you've got a muscle in your back, and what it does is X. Oh, and you've got this muscle, and you've got this, and you've got this thing called the posterior chain. And I was going, oh, wait, this is information, and this is intellectual information, and I've never had a problem with learning that. Oh, I can actually learn how to use my body in the same way that I could learn, you know, maths in school, because ultimately it's all just facts. And that's why the weightlifting helped, because that helped. Okay, I'm practicing. Oh, I can feel that, yes, when I do that, I can feel that that muscle group is aching afterwards, and that's connected to that. And I started really feeling, okay, like, this is what it feels like to use a muscle. And then I started, oh, if I do that, if I literally just do that motion, then I would start doing that, and I'd start thinking, okay, now what muscles can I feel when I do that? And I was doing that all in my karate practice. And every time I was in the dojo and I practiced my techniques, I wouldn't just try and make the shape anymore. I'd try and go, I'd be doing it and I'd be thinking, okay, what am I feeling? What muscles am I feeling? What's tensing? What's relaxing? And so because I realized I had to literally from zero intellectually teach my brain what my muscles did. And
Okay.
so there was that. But also what I really, really want to say is, with regard to teaching somebody who has something like dyspraxia, you can't, and I know we've kind of extolled the virtues of hard work, but you know, if you can work as hard as you'd like, but if you never think about what you're doing, it's not gonna go anywhere. I mean, Simon's talked so much to us in the club about, you know, it's no good practicing if you're practicing the wrong thing, because you're just practicing to get worse.
Yeah.
So
And so,
you've got to think about it. You've got to think about, like, okay, how am I doing this technique? Why am I doing it? What's it for? And ultimately, the question that kind of comes, all of martial arts, if you are coming at it from a martial arts perspective as opposed to a sports perspective, the one question that has to be behind it all: if I do this, is it going to hurt?
Yeah.
Because it has to be. It has to be. If you are practicing it as a martial art, and that might sound a bit grim to some people, but ultimately what you really want to know is, am I going to be able to defend myself? And so every question has to come back to that. And it all has to be like, how do I make this work so that I know that, you know, if somebody does try and hurt me, I will be able to do something about it.
it sounds to me, Tanya, so what really worked well for you in terms of that getting that knowledge, and even in defining the task, is really getting clear, getting a good understanding intellectually of the biomechanics of how everything works then in the actual movement. Sounds like that really helped you then even embody your physical body in a new way.
And also, I think Simon would probably agree, it was around this time, I remember I just started constantly asking him questions. I mean, every time he'd do a demonstration, I'd be like, okay, but why is this the case? Why is this? Where does this come from? Like, you know, and I wanted to know, like, everything about, like, the techniques, the history of the techniques, why we were doing a certain thing. Okay, what muscle am I supposed to be using? And all the time I was interrupting demonstrations and, you know, to ask him questions. And sometimes he'd say, you know, I'll tell you after the demonstration. And sometimes you would have to say that, but
but actually this is, if I may, Tanya, this is actually probably a good point for me to say from a coach's perspective, because I think it's great you've given a very comprehensive explanation of how you've gone through that process of, you know, hitting on, you like the intellectual element, the biomechanics, or the history, the background. And of course, from a coach's perspective, that's not for everyone. So other coaches can't take this now and go, that's how I teach someone who's dyspraxic. The majority of that came from Tanya. So in terms of me learning how to do this, the reality is it's trial and error. And I'm as much led by it by Tanya as I was by my own learning. So when I was working with Tanya, I mean, actually, if I sort of ignore the working with Tanya for a moment, anyone who's in a coaching situation should be able to look at something someone's doing, identify what they're doing well and what they're not doing so well, and then try to find ways to improve the things that they're already doing well, and also try to counteract and then overcome the problems that they may have in doing a particular technique or a movement or whatever it is. And the reality is there's no there's no better substitute for anything than experience. And if you can see somebody doing something and you identify a fault, it doesn't mean you immediately know the solution to it, but as long as you can identify the fault or the problem, it becomes a problem solving task. And it's primarily the coach's job to then come up with exercises or instructions or anything that's required to help them to, you know, progress at that stage. But while it's the responsibility of the coach to do that, essentially because they should have the higher knowledge level by nature of the position they're in, you're still going to be led by the student themselves. And so with Tanya, it was very much a case of, I could identify, say a fault in a technique, but the way I choose to approach it with Tanya will be different to how I will approach it to somebody else. And again, I mean, I know I've said it before already several times, but once you start to build up a relationship with somebody, that professional rapport with somebody, I started to know that from Tanya herself that she responds well to detailed analysis, intellectual thought, biomechanic information. So that was actually a catalyst for me to go away and research more about it. I started to look at how the body works, why techniques work in a certain way, and it was it was a development process for me. It was brilliant. It improved my own training and my own knowledge set because I had to help somebody else improve as well. And I couldn't just I couldn't just pluck a method out of a hat and say this will probably work. And making it bespoke for Tanya was very important. And hence why, like she said, sometimes she would be in there'll be a demonstration of something, and she would be there, hand up every few seconds with the question. I'd have to say, I'll sort it, I'll talk to you afterwards, because I knew exactly what she wanted to ask, but it probably wasn't, it's not that it wouldn't be beneficial to others, but it wasn't maybe information that they needed at that stage. So the ability to say, here's a general demonstration, this is what I want you to do, off you go. And then Tanya and others, I could walk around and give some targeted information to help them improve, or whatever that I felt they would need. So from a coaching point of view, don't be afraid to be led by the student as well. I mean, Tanya mentioned my fiance. She's she used to be a British judo champion, actually, as well as she's a third dan in karate as well. And she is very nearly a qualified PT, and she is also a qualified sport masseuse. So she does have a considerable edge when it comes to physiology and biomechanics compared to me, although I have done my own studying on it as well. But yeah, it worked for Tanya, and I knew it worked for Tanya. I think I've got, if you include Tanya, I think I've got 3 students with dyspraxia. And they're different ages as well, and different ability levels within the karate. And I address all 3 of them in very, very different approaches. And that's really all been possible because of my experience with Tanya. I've taken exercises that worked with Tanya and tried to apply them with these students, and they might get me 60% of the way to an improvement, and then I work specifically on problem solving for that person. And it's being able to build up that little toolbox of things that you can use, but adjust them as required.
But the reason I kind of wanted to bring that up is because within a lot of martial arts, there is still very much that mentality of, we do not explain it, we just drill it and drill it and drill it, and eventually you will somehow get better. And what I kind of want to say is, like, especially if you've got somebody disabled, it's just not going to work.
Yes, I will agree with that. There is a mentality, and this is not to denigrate it, but there is a mentality of you purely work on repetition. You just repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, and by the nature of doing that, you will improve. There is, without going into it because it's not really relevant as such, but a lot of that can come down to the culture that some of the martial arts came from, which was often a very strict system of I show, you do, and it carried on like that. There's I think it was in a book by Sensei Dave Hazard, and he talked about that when he trained in Japan, there was never any talking. You just trained. All the talking happened with a cup of sake afterwards, and a bowl of rice, and it was always afterwards that they actually had any discussion about anything. The problem is that we don't, certainly over here, we don't operate in the same way. The likelihood that you finish training and as a club go and socialize immediately is very unlikely, because we train in community halls and leisure centers and so on. And the danger is that if people work purely on repetition and just drilling skills, if you lose that ability to hold discussion, you're missing out on a massive part of it. And from my teaching point of view, I like to try to demonstrate, explain, and discuss in all in the same moment if I can. It will normally involve a demonstration of what I want people to do, a verbal explanation without me doing it, and then sometimes a discussion or an explanation while I'm doing the technique, and then get questions, and then off they go. And try and keep it relatively condensed, because it could take a long time otherwise. But with different learning styles that people have, there's a good chance you're going to capture something for everybody in that moment in a short space of time, enough to get them started, and then it fuels what needs to come next.
Lovely, thank you. Thanks for both of you for all of that valuable insight. Another aspect when it comes to inclusive practice is considering the setting or placement options within the practice. And I know, Simon, you've already mentioned that karate is very conducive to inclusion, and I think partly because what you've already referenced is the setup of a session. So when we consider the inclusion spectrum, which is one way, it's in a model often used in adaptive physical activity, it explains different ways in which a practice can be set up. I'm hearing in what you've said already that karate practice in and of itself is quite conducive, and it would use the settings of like the parallel setting, where people of different ability levels, are practicing maybe at the same skill, or maybe even at different levels of their own grade, or wherever they are towards their own skills. But can you say a little bit more about that, or if there's anything to add?
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully, if I edit this video properly, I'll show that diagram now. And I think that where it works nicely is that the placement options are all available, and they can be all available within the same session at different stages. So I would normally say, from my point of view, is it starts off as an entirely open placement. Everybody can participate. There are certain elements that are typically always joined by everybody. So the everything from the bowing rituals at the beginning, the warm-up is always done together. Normally the first few exercises are all done together, and then, for argument's sake, if we were in line, just doing line work, we might all start, whether you're white or black belt, just doing the same technique. It might just be an individual technique, and we're all performing it at our own relevant ability levels, just to get a bit of atmosphere and a bit of mood. And then a moment later, we're switching to that parallel approach, where I'm saying, white belts and orange belts, can you do this? And then I want red belts to yellow belts to do this, and then they all perform at the same time, but are all now performing different things. It can then go a little bit further, then that there can be partner work. It might be a group of people working on a type of partner work that is relevant for their current grade or their ability groups, and there could be 4 or 5 of these going on within the same session at the same moment. And that to me is very positive from an inclusion point of view, because you're typically, no one's ever completely out of their depth. I like to describe it as, I try to keep people at a stage where they're treading water. There's always a little bit of struggle that they've got to do to improve, but they're never going under. It's essentially that idea of a little bit of challenge. But then while that's going on, it can be very easy in that environment, because it's an individual development, for me to turn to one student and notice they're having a problem with something. Let's, for argument's sake, say everyone's doing partner work. I could pluck that one person away and say, the person left over, just join a group of 3 for a moment, and I can go and work on entirely separate stuff with that individual, to say, you're leaning when you do one of your punches, and so we could just do an exercise for a couple of minutes, leave them to practice a couple of minutes, and then go back to their partners and look for an improvement. And this can all happen within the space of 10 minutes, all of those examples.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise then, sometimes you get people who might have an injury at that moment in the club. Say for argument's sake, they've got a problem with their knee and we're practicing a kick. I will be able to modify very quickly on the spot something that they can still do that captures the essence of what I want them to perform, minus the thing that's going to cause them a problem. And that again comes back to why I think it's I think the environment's so inclusive is because because you've got the team ethos of everyone wants to support each other, but you're not reliant on that person at the same, or you're not reliant on everyone else at the same moment either. There's never a how can I put it, there's never a moment of shame to be pulled away from something to have individual attention. If anything, individual attention is seen as, I don't use the word an honor or anything like that, but people see it as a positive boon that they're being singled out for help and guidance, and it gives the Tanya will tell you as well that I don't ask people to call me sensei, or they can just call me Simon. But often what will happen is when I pull someone aside, give them some help, and I say, right, off you go, they normally will turn and bow and say thank you, sensei, not because they have to, but because they obviously value what they've been told and they're grateful and they go back. And whereas we talked about PE environments, sometimes if I was doing a drill and I wasn't doing it very well, it's very easy for a PE, and I'm not denigrating PE teachers, I wanted to be one for a long time. It can be very easy for a PE teacher to see someone who's struggling, pull them out of the exercise and say, go and do this instead. And it feels like a punishment because I'm not good enough to do something else. And it doesn't have, I don't think it has that feeling within a dojo environment.
Actually, I mean, with that, I mean, my experience of PE was more like kind of, I get a shrug and, oh, well, I guess you just can't do that.
Oh,
yeah.
Sound like the PE teacher just mightn't have had the competency or just didn't know, yeah, that's unfortunate, Tanya. And
I think with the kind of the concept of placement options, though, I think with that, because of that belt system, I think it is important to, kind of bring across that thing of like, that doesn't mean that, you get kind of special treatment.
No, agreed.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, well, you're disabled, so we don't expect as high a standard from you.
This is actually a good point when we talk about sort of adaptation models for martial arts, I suppose, that I, from my point of view, I've always been very upfront that I still expect a certain level of standard at every grade and development, no matter how long it takes to get there. And Tanya and I have discussed it in the past that she would never have wanted to have what I sort of would label now a dyspraxic first dan. She's a first dan at the same standard and expectation as every other person in our organization, and it didn't matter how long it took Tanya to get there because she earned
over a decade.
it. That's it. But she earned it, and she can stand up there with anyone else of that grade and demonstrate a suitable ability. We know that there are going to be some areas that she's not as good at, but what we found important, or I think was important with between Tanya and I, was that I said to her, I understand that if she gets asked to do a long combination in a grading 3 times, the chance is that when she does each one, they're probably not going to be the same as each other. That her dyspraxia is probably going to make her do a different technique on
one. Because one thing it actually messes with is I think my working memory is in the bottom 30th percentile of the population. So, I mean, I have a fantastic long-term memory, but then I've got a really bad working memory. So if you show me like a complicated karate combination, there's and it's not a matter, and again, that's one thing where it isn't a matter of practice. I'm never going to be able to remember that sequence kind of as is.
And I should just point out, I don't do the gradings. They're all done by our chief instructor, and it's not to say that there's no considerations given for Tanya being dyspraxic, but what was important was that that the considerations that were given were sort of conditional, in the sense that she still had to be up to standard, but you would, if she was told to do a long combination 3 times and each combination was different to each other by accident, that would be a little nod to the side to say, okay, that's likely the dyspraxia. However, were the techniques that she did by accident still good techniques? And as long as they were good techniques, then we wouldn't fault that. If Tanya was asked to do a stepping punch and she did a reverse punch instead, she would be judged on, was that punch actually still a good one, even if it wasn't the one I asked for? And
Also, was the combination a good combination, right? Because usually if you perform it, it would be a technique that should at least make sense, having followed the previous technique, right? It should flow.
If I may give an example, if you don't mind, on, I think it was Tanya's 3rd kyu or 2nd kyu grading, and she was with 3 other people going for the same belt as well, and they were asked to perform a combination, exactly the scenario described. They were told, do this combination, do it 3 times, and the other 3 people did the combination exactly as asked 3 times. Tanya did basically 3 different combinations. And when the sensei said stop, he told the other 3 to rest and asked Tanya to do it again just once. And he then turned round to the others and pointed to Tanya and said, that's how I want you to do it. And it wasn't because she did the techniques differently. It was because of the attitude she put into them. The difference was that the other 3 did technically very good combinations, but there was no emphasis, there was no oomph, there was no feeling in their techniques. Whereas he actually said, looking at Tanya, he said, I would not want to be on the end of one of her punches.
Actually, yeah, I remember it exactly, because I remember him saying, I think he actually even pointed out that they weren't the right techniques. He said I think he almost like did this kind of like twist, because he kind of did it. He said those weren't the techniques I asked for. He said, you all did the techniques I asked for. He said, but I wouldn't want to be on the end of that.
Yeah. And the reason I bring this up as important for adapting from an inclusion point of view is that I always made the point to Tanya that even if she has I don't like to use this word, but if she had a deficiency in her technique, that's understandable. But the thing that would not be forgivable is a deficiency in her attitude, because that she's still in control of. And I've always pushed that emphasis that she can make up for any faults essentially with the way she comes across and what she does, and how it feels to her makes a massive difference to how it looks to an observer as well.
And I think as well, that kind of also, that was important for me, because it also really put into my head that there was one kind of, I guess, criteria that I was aiming for in everything I did. And that was, as Paul put it, I wouldn't want to be on the end of that.
Spirit.
Because as I said before, like, that's what, at the end of the day, you are doing a martial art. And therefore that always, if you are practicing it with the mindset of a martial artist, which is different than the mindset of a sports person, you're not practicing it because, I mean, I don't like that actually affected the way I even did karate, because I don't care if I can do a really beautiful looking high kick to the face if it's just going to be like my toe brushing against somebody's face, because my favorite kick, I think, is I think the name for it would be I'm not sure about this, but Kansetsu Geri. which I believe translates to dislocation kick, but
Oh yes, okay. Yes, I
yeah.
know what
So
you mean.
because my favorite kick is a very short and small kick, which would normally go into the knee joint, because the mentality that we were training with was always that question of
Would it be
would it
effective?
work and would it be effective? And it's like, okay, maybe I can't make it look beautiful, but you know, at the end of the day, if it's going to be effective, it probably wouldn't look beautiful anyway.
Great. That's lovely. That's a lot of that's a lot, and some very valuable points in there from both of you actually. And I know when you mentioned the adaptation models, Simon, and from what I'm hearing, so both of you are familiar with the inclusive times model, and it's where there's different aspects of an activity or to be considered, especially when including somebody. So there's the time, and from what I'm hearing already, you know, the time piece definitely for you, Tanya, was in terms of the patience, you know, and realizing that, you know, it might take you a little bit longer to get your black belt, and just not wanting, you know, having that patience rather than trying to rush through it, and just that consideration there. And what I'm also hearing a lot is, so we have the time, then there's instruction, movement, the environment, and support. And what I'm hearing as well, and from also speaking with you two before, I know that the combination of the instruction and the movement is what really worked well for you two, definitely to support you in your specific case, or in your specific practice, Tanya. And so I know in particular you have some examples actually of how there was one skill, shirigiri, that you've worked well among many other skills, but there's one that you have some very clear examples of how you worked, and how you, Simon, you instructed, and you kind of bounced back and forth between Tanya's needs in relation to the movement and her needs in relation to how to instruct her best in a way that will be understood, and will land best with her. So could you share a little bit more about how that worked for you, say for when it comes to first learning the shirigiri, and could you take us through the journey of what that would look like with a specific skill?
So when so Tanya would have first started learning a shirigiri. So for those who don't do Japanese martial arts, it's a back kick, and it's typically taught with a step across, turn, and then you kick backwards, because it works on a lot of mechanics then. And Tanya would have been learning this by about her fourth belt, would have been around the time she would have started to do it. And the videos that we've got were prior to Tanya doing her black belt, so just the grade before. And it's always been a kick Tanya struggled with, but I should also point out it's a kick that many people struggle with. There are lots of people I know who still can't do it, not very well. They can do it enough to be passable, which is fine. Everyone's built differently and so on. But this one particular lesson we were working, I think we were actually just working on some individual techniques just to look for improvement. And I spotted that Tanya was she was struggling with the kick. So if I said she did everything, if you were to write it and to describe it, everything was done correctly. You know, she stepped across, she would turn, she kicked backwards, she turns and recovers the way she kicked. The problem was that the kick was always going off at a massive angle in comparison to the target. I mean, we're talking sort of, you know, probably like a 45 degree angle away from the target, in some cases. And then normally her balance would go, and um, I know she won't mind me saying this, but Tanya was getting incredibly frustrated, to the point where I don't think anyone wanted to go and train with her. Because there was a face of thunder there, of that frustration that she knew how to do it, and she knew she should be able to do it, but why can't she do it? And I could see that. So mid-class, I just took her aside for a moment, and the difficulty with a back kick, and this is why I think it's a good example, is because when you do it, you don't actually look in the direction you're kicking. The idea is you know where your target is, and you purely work on essentially a what would the term be? I guess it's proprioception, the feeling of that physical movement to know where it's going to hit. And because Tanya couldn't see what was going wrong, I could understand why it was even more frustrating. So it's actually a technique that relies on external influence if you're going to improve it for anyone, really. And all I did is I just took Tanya to the side and basically said, take a breath. This is what's happening. I didn't say what was causing the problem. All I said was that your kick is going off an angle and you're losing your balance. And I started with, why do you think that is? Because it's more important for me to see what Tanya comes up with, what she thinks the problem might be. In all honesty, I can't actually remember her response, but based on that response, then gave me the opportunity to do something next. And all I did was I went and got my phone. I took a video of her doing the kick, and that was it. And then I just turned it round and we watched it on my phone. And of course, that was the first time that Tanya had actually seen her doing the kick. And this bit I do remember clearly because she was really frustrated with how bad it looked. And I had to sort of, hand on shoulder and say, don't worry, we'll sort it out. And all I did was I tried to identify with Tanya being involved in the process of working out what the fault was. And so it would be a case of, if memory serves, Tanya identified correctly that the kick was off target, her balance was off, and her head was dropping quite low. And so even if there were no solutions there, we knew Tanya had identified 3 points that she thought were vital, and I agreed. And all I did then was I just tried to address them one at a time. And I gave Tanya an exercise to try and get her to make the foot. And this is where the coaching side came in. Her kick was off target because the foot was lifting sort of outside the body and going almost around her body. Whereas ideally, the foot should pass underneath the line of the body instead. It should sort of go, like under the pelvis and under the central line. I said, use the flat of your foot to kick the back of your own thigh. Now, from a technical point of view, that's not how you do the kick. But all it did is it just tried to encourage the repetition of the foot coming underneath the body and not lifting around it. And if I remember correctly, we said, I think, kick the back of the leg, your own leg 3 times, and then on the 4th one, kick forwards. And there were still balance issues because we hadn't addressed those. But immediately what happened was, with the foot coming under the line of the body, the kick would go closer, if not on target. And it was getting that little bit underneath. And I think you probably, would you say you felt a difference in that early on? It's hard to remember.
I think it was. I think if I did, I think it was quite a small difference.
Yeah.
And I think even at that point, I do remember that I was still really frustrated and quite annoyed.
Yeah. So, but what we did then was we took a video of Tanya doing that, and I used the slow motion feature on my phone. I mean, in fact, I bought my phone very much based on the idea that it had a very good quality slow motion camera, because I had ideas of potentially using it in the club. And so once Tanya did that exercise, I videoed that one and showed her the difference. And the fact that Tanya could identify the difference and see, oh, that was an improvement, started to get rid of a little bit of that frustration. And then from that point, it was a case of working on the balance and the posture. And the turn is a difficult part. I mean, she knows how to do it. She knows step across with the front foot because it changes your alignment. You can rotate on the base of your feet, and essentially what would now be your front leg is in a position to kick straight backwards, and that's where the target is. But what would often happen with Tanya is that as she would step across, her body weight would come up, and as she turns, with the head being the heaviest part of the body, it threw her weight off to the side, so that she was sort of twisting away from the target every time she did it. And the focus for me then was, I need to find a way to get her lower. And in the end, the phrase that I think clicked for Tanya was, I said, imagine you're screwing your body down into the floor. And in the video, you can actually see there's a moment where Tanya hesitates, and I'm guessing sort of has that moment where she thinks of that phrase, and you can see her sort of turn and crouch her body into the floor.
And
And at
actually,
that point, does the
on
kick.
the on the most recent one, I'm not sure if I actually got the video on my phone, but I think I had that in my mind when I was doing that.
Well, actually, more than likely you have. I'm assuming you're looking for it. It'll be up on
Yeah.
the screen here. But that recent video of you doing it in the gym is, I mean, you've been away for, is it a year now? And you said it. I know
Yeah.
it's certainly been a long time since you did that and went through it in that process. And I think what's great is that even after all that time, it's clearly stayed there in Tanya's development, and it's now it's made a long-term difference, not just a short-term gain. And
Oh
yet
yeah, I
that,
mean, I could feel how to do it. Like, you know, I could feel like, and it was that thing again. Like, I knew when I did it, I was like, okay, it's gonna feel like this.
yes, and I think when we did the videos in the club at the time, it was really helpful for Tanya to have that visualization of it. And the only other thing that we did, because I think that whole process probably took us 10 to 15 minutes to get a massive, what I think is a massive improvement for any student, whether they had dyspraxia or not. I think is a massive improvement. And the only other thing I did was I did a video of me doing the kick, and I think one of the exercises as well, so that she had a point of reference. It wasn't to say, look at my kick, mine's so good, because actually there's a lot of things I look at in that video and go, I don't like this. But it meant that I could send those videos to Tanya, and if she ever had a problem, she's always got a point of comparison of where she started, where she got to, and a point of reference of seeing me do it as well to help her get back to that in a very, very quick space of time. And I think that's a tool that a lot of instructors should make use of as well, is just that simple video and brief analysis can do absolute wonders for people.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. If you made that much progress over the course of 15 minutes or so, and as we've seen, Tanya, you know, we saw at the beginning and now a couple of years later how you execute that skill. Yeah, thank you. And well, and I know, so the other components of the adaptation model, the inclusive times model, the environment and the support, I know clearly, you know, that's not something you specifically had to work with in your case. You know, from what I can hear, that supportive environment is something that was just naturally there. That's something definitely the unconscious competence that's just naturally there for you, Simon. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, you know, there's some really valuable tips and insight from your sharings and your collaboration and your journey together that, you know, could definitely support or guide some other coaches who are learning how to be more inclusive. And to wrap up, I'm wondering, are there any key takeaways that either of you have for a coach who is embarking on their journey of inclusive practice?
I think from my point of view of learning to be a coach on the job, as it were, you know, and it's not my job, but, you know, having to learn out of necessity is don't focus just on the skills of what you do. Focus on the developing that environment. It needs to be you need a welcoming social environment if you're going to then develop what I think is the most important, but which is the relationship. If you can foster a relationship of trust with participants, then it becomes very easy to work with them on any adaptations they need, because there's an acceptance from, or an understanding from them, that you are trying your best as well. And then at that stage is, as I mentioned once before, is don't be afraid to be ignorant of disabilities. You know, ask questions, go and weigh and research, and trial and error may seem uncomfortable, but the reality is that it's how your teaching is going to evolve. The student will help inform that absolutely massively, and that fear factor of maybe not wanting to look like you don't know what you're doing as a coach, it needs to be overcome, because, and I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do, but once you get to a stage where you're not afraid to not be infallible, once you hit that point, it's easy to have open discussions with people, and I think the concern a lot of coaches have, particularly new coaches, is that they often feel like they have to stamp their mark of authority on. They have to be they have to be respected as a coach and a professional. But I would just say actually that respect is earned, and there's actually people will probably respect you more if you're able to admit failings as well. And as long
admit
as
that you don't know. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as long as you can then show that you learn from them as well, and I think it comes down to that more than anything else. Technical knowledge is an addition to that environment, to everything else.
Absolutely, I agree, and thank you so much for all of that, that wisdom, Simon. Because when it comes to working with people with disabilities, we like to see it as, people have various types of functional difficulties, not getting too bogged down in the label or the actual health condition, so to say. But it's really just thinking about, okay, how does this person, how is their functioning affected, and how can I support them? And definitely that social environment, and that what can arise from that place, and of that rapport, that professional rapport that you spoke of. And definitely when it comes to disability, there's so many disabilities out there, you can't learn them all. Even experts in the field, you can't learn everything about every disability. So it is about working with your students.
I think if I just may add one, that you just made me think of something that I think is quite important as well, is that specifically for martial art coaches, is to consider that if someone with a disability comes to you, there's a very good chance that you're almost their last ditch attempt to some sort of physical activity, because they've likely tried the football, the rugby, the athletics, the gymnastics, and they've specifically looked for something outside the norm, as a way of escaping those environments and trying to find somewhere to fit. And it means that you don't necessarily have to be more delicate about it, but is sometimes consider the journey they might have been on before they even got to you as an important thing. As Tanya mentioned, she was encouraged to do dance or a martial art, and so she was actually directed in the martial arts way, as a way of specifically helping her with her dyspraxia.
And that's huge, right? Because I mean, think about the difference that will make to somebody's life. I mean, and on the one hand, part of me thinks maybe I shouldn't put pressure on people in this way, but I want to be honest about it, in that, if I had not found martial arts like that, as Simon has just mentioned, that would have been the end of any attempt at any sort of physical activity for me. Like so many people who have dyspraxia, who have something like that, do this. It's like, okay, and like the kind of like the school almost kind of tried to tell me to, oh, you can't do that, so just go and be good at something else. And then people just kind of, oh yeah, well I'm not good at that, I'm good at something else. But what karate gave me was that thing of like, no, you actually can learn things, and we expect that standard from you. And so because of that, I that's not just karate, that's because of that I go to the gym. Because of that, I do running, and I've done yoga because of my mother, and all of these things. And if we actually look at that, because of that, when I'm older, maybe I won't get osteoporosis. Because of that, maybe I won't end up in a wheelchair when I'm older. I mean, that sounds, I know I do have a bit of a tendency to go to these more morbid places, but when I look at that has been the outcome for some people, that they end up disabled when they are older because they've been put off physical activity so strongly. I mean, that's one thing that I saw that with my own grandparents, right? They were so, it had done so much damage to them to not have maintained that physical activity throughout their lives. And it could be the difference if you create that inclusive environment. It could be the difference in a whole life being completely different. And a better quality of life for someone. You know, it could have so much positive impact, and that's why I care so much, because, you know, so many people who are disabled, they just get the shrug and, oh well, guess you can't do that. And it was that difference between, it's not an exaggeration to say my whole life is different because of that. It's so important.
That's beautiful, Tanya. And the impact it's had on your life, you know, obviously it goes beyond the dojo.
Yeah.
Far beyond the dojo.
Because it also gave me this attitude of, and also it gave me the attitude of not, you know, being bitter, like, oh, you can't do something. Well, no, you don't just give up. It's like, wait, like, you can figure this out. There's a way to solve this. There's a way to go around it. There's a way to, you know, other than what everybody else was telling me was that, oh, there's just some things you can't do. And then what karate was telling me was like, there's a way. If you pay attention, if you look hard enough, if you try and figure it out, and if you practice, there is a way.
And I should just say as well, I hope it's fair to say that from a coaching point of view, that you knew you weren't alone in that.
Yeah. But what I would like to say to any coaches is, you know, one, like, as Simon mentioned, look at the individual person. You know, don't just assume like, yes, I'm going to research this disability and I will tell you what you need. Ask them. Just, you know, people are quite good at knowing what their disability does and what it is, and so just ask them and they'll tell you, and it's going to present differently in different people. But the other thing is, you know, don't do that thing of just like, oh, if I just drill and drill and drill, they'll get better. You know, actually, you do have to do that thing of being like, okay, how do we do this? And actually asking the question of, okay, you're finding this difficult. We've got to accept that that's where you're starting. We've got to accept that that's the issue and that is how it is. But okay, now where do we go from there? And you have to ask that question, and you can't just say like, oh yeah, go and practice it 1,000,000 times and you'll get better. They might get better at the wrong thing.
I should say very quickly that that there is, of course, still a time and a place for that drilling atmosphere.
Yes.
But sometimes if someone has been struggling with that, sometimes all that you need afterwards as a coach is a 2-minute conversation with them at the end of the lesson. And that frustration will, you know, if you acknowledge that they may have been frustrated doing that, but highlight a positive, that could be all it needs to keep that person on board.
Yeah. Fantastic. I don't know how many nuggets of wisdom are in there. Surely there's something for every coach out there, no matter what martial arts they're working in, or coaching or teaching. Surely that there's plenty of wisdom, because you know, lots of what you've shared here isn't specific to karate, you know, and it isn't specific to, you know, it's really about working with the person and finding what's work for you as a coach, you as your student, and for your context as well. So thank you both for sharing all of your wisdom and sharing, you know, your journey together. And yeah, we're very grateful.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks.
Absolutely.